Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everybody to the first Circle of Wine Writers event of 2025. This is number 110 of Let's Talk About sessions. And this year today we're talking about Jura wine 10 years on, the inside story with Wink Lorch. I'd like to extend a welcome to those of our members who are joining us for the first time and also the non-members who are also with us as well today. The Circle of Wine Writers founded in 1960 in the UK, and today we have over 270 members, which includes wine writers, broadcasters, educators, and other professional communicators based across the world, around 50% in the UK and 50% elsewhere. There's more information about joining the Circle on our website, and also more information about the Circle itself. I'll now hand over to our chairperson, Meg Maker, who will introduce our speaker today. Over to you, Meg.
Thank you, Andrea. Welcome, everyone. It's so great to see so many faces and so many people joining us in this first Let's Talk of the 2025 season. Facebook today reminded me of a post from January 6th of last year where I posted asking for people to join me in supporting Wink's Kickstarter for her new update to her book. Now, here we are, months after the book's release. Wow, that was fast. Wink is a wine writer, author, educator, and editor. She is a Circle committee member, and she's also a founder member of the Association of Wine Educators. She is globally recognized as the expert in the wines of the Jura, the Savoie, and the French Alps. And she has won the Andre Simon Drinks Prize Award for this book and her first book about Jura, and was also shortlisted for the Andre Simon Drinks Prize as well. Wink actually splits her time between London and the Haute-Savoie in the French Alps, whence she joins us today. She does not actually live in Jura, contrary to popular opinion. That Venable is 2.5 hours away from where she lives, so it is a bit of a schlep. And last January and February, she spent some time revisiting the Jura producers and visiting some new ones as well, I believe, at least the new generations, to kind of understand what had been happening in the 10 years since she published her first book, Jura Wine. The result is this update, which is a smaller tome. A lot has happened in the 10 years since this first book was published. Jura has received international recognition, thanks in part to Wink's book. New generations are taking over properties, and climate chaos and short vintages have ravaged people's finances and cellars. So the result of her research is not a second edition, sort of by choice, but an update to the first tome, because much of the first book remains germane: the wine law, the cuisine recommendations that she makes, historic cellars, histories, and of course the styles of wine. But in this new book, Wink presents a fresh view of the latest developments and challenges. And today she's going to share what she's learned with us in this Let's Talk webinar. So with that, over to you, Wink.
Thank you very much. I too am suffering from a cold, so I'm hoping that I don't get over enthusiastic in talking to you and develop a coughing fit. So bear with me. Thank you for that intro, Meg. You've actually managed to say most of what I was going to say in the next hours already, so really much more succinctly. So that was excellent. I appreciate that. I will just elaborate before I start a PowerPoint presentation, just to elaborate a bit on why I didn't do a second edition, which quite a few people have asked me, and why I chose to do a companion volume, which is my term for what I did, and which appears, as far as I can tell, never to have been done, which is not why I chose to do it. But one of the very first people to write a review, David Crossley, a wine blogger with a particular interest in natural wines and in Jura and Savoie and world of Wonderful World of Wine or something. I've got that wrong. But anyway, he actually wrote in this review that it was nicer to have a companion volume than a second edition, because when you buy a second edition, so much of the stuff is nearly all the same. Whereas in my new book, more than 95% is new material. So that's what makes it worth buying, I guess. But the reason for not doing second edition was that honestly, it's become so difficult to visit the wine producers, even for me. And it would have taken me a good 2 years to research. And frankly, the research that I did over 4 months, really, January to April, was agonizing and painful enough, begging people to see me, and begging them to answer my phone calls and begging them to respond to anything. That if I'd had to do a real second edition where I would have had to update every single producer and add a load more, it would have killed me, frankly. But what's more, it would have been extremely costly. And I self-publish, even though Académie de Vin Library distribute my books. I self-publish. And I would have had to have all the photography redone, because 10 years on, all the producers look different. And there would have been tons of new producers, and everything, the whole layout would have been different. So a very, very, very costly thing, even though the technical part and the history part and the food part could have been left more or less as they were. So that's why, mainly why I did it. And a companion volume came to me. The other reason I was delaying a decision, and I'd actually said I wouldn't do anything ever again on Jura in book form, was because they were having such a series of difficult vintages. But then they had 22 and 23 in a row that were both very, very good vintages, even though the volume wasn't huge in 22, it was in 23. I'm going to go into that a bit more in a while. But that sort of buoyed me up, and I thought, well, okay, finally, they've got some wine in the cellar. And hey, it's 10 years. And my original idea was to write just to make it even smaller than it is, and to just write a series of articles at the beginning. But the articles got longer and longer and really did become mini chapters about all the many changes that were even more than I thought. And then it was about doing mini producer profiles. But like I'm very bad at talking briefly, I'm very bad at writing briefly. And so trying to keep these profiles as mini profiles was quite hard, to say the least. But I ended up actually writing about 150 producers, whereas there were 90 in the first book. But I wrote very, very briefly. So all of those were reasons. I'm just going to take a second to share my screen, and let's see, hopefully it's this one. Let's go. Is that looking good?
That's perfect, Wink. Thank you. Yes.
Yeah, that's good. Excellent. So Jura wine, 10 years on. Why? Sorry, give me a minute because it's not. There we go. I've got too many screens on at once. That's my problem. Let's go. That's better. Excellent. First of all, what's made Jura a star? Was it all me that did it? Absolutely not. I honestly, it even before, long before my first book, the Jura had already become a star in certain markets. As the Circle of Wine Writers is UK based, and as there's a selection of UK members and others with us, I will just say that with a few honourable exceptions, notably Cave de Pérenne, importers were very, very slow to take up Jura in the UK. And people were very, very slow to recognise Jura as being an interesting area. I was totally and utterly treated as a freak by my colleagues and wine people and wine trade and so on. Whereas in the US, I was treated very, very differently because the US recognized Jura very early. And it was really thanks because of the US that I wrote the original book. And this was thanks to certain really, clever wine producers. It wasn't the promotion that Jura did in the US, even though Jura did do some promotion in the US for the bigger companies. It really was the importers that brought in producers who have now, even 10 years ago, were becoming rock star producers. And so they're the ones that recognized it at the same time as the producers themselves were making better and better and more interesting wines, keeping their authenticity, keeping the traditional wines, and yet being innovative as well. And something about this quirkiness and the fact that nobody could understand Jura was really part of what has given it star appeal. And yet the wines have tasted better and better and better, not all of the styles are everybody's taste. Also, the environment has always been at the front of Jura wines. There's been a strong, strong group of organic growers, and that has made the people interested as well. A lot of people seem to think that Jura is dominated by indigenous grape varieties. That's not quite true, since Chardonnay is their biggest planting of grapes and has been for centuries, quite frankly. But there are 3 strong indigenous grape varieties that are superstars. And today there are, and this has been coming up for 10 years, terroir Chardonnays that rival Burgundy and, of course, are cheaper than Burgundy, even though they have shot up in price. Every wine region has great characters. Jura just seems to have a ridiculous amount of them, and they are all so different one from another. So it's become a star because really it's the insider's top drop. And then they're really tough to find, and now it's hard to visit. And all of this makes it more and more and more of a star. But I'm not sure whether that's a good thing or not. And just to go back to this, this is the photo that's actually on the cover of the new book, thanks to Mick Rock, who's with us today, Mick Rock of CFAS Picture Library. And these are fossils. They are star fossils. Crinoids in English, or pentecrines in pentecrine in French, montecrine. You don't only find them in the Jura, you find them in Chablis, of course, and various other limestone-dominated places, but they are in the village of Étoile, which of course means star, and I just thought it all worked with this star quality of Jura. This presentation is not about going through the basics of Jura. However, I absolutely have to emphasize the size of Jura, because people seem to forget about it, how small it is, or some people have never known, or some people don't understand the numbers. So yes, it's increased in the last 10 years by about 200 hectares. So there are all sorts of different figures. Statistics and figures are so hard to come by with any accuracy. But within the AOC land, or rather those declared as AOC, there's about 2,150 hectares, just 0.3% of France's vineyards. Now, think about it. About half of Chablis, just 50% larger than Margaux. Now, last I knew, Chablis produces one style of wine from one grape. I'm not talking about the Auxerrois, if anybody wants to get picky. I'm talking about Chablis. Sure, there are different terroirs, there are different qualities. There's Premier Cru, Grand Cru, there's Petit Chablis. But hey, it's Chardonnay. And it's all made more or less in the same way. And then there's AOC Margaux, sort of the same thing. Isn't there just one style of wine? And yet, in Jura, there are 5 main grapes. There's sparkling red, rosé, white, vin jaune, vin de paille, mac vin. And that's not to count some of the other peculiar wines within those categories and beyond. So there's huge diversity for this tiny, tiny number. About 35% certified organic today, which is huge actually. The average in France, in case you're not aware, is around 20% last I knew. It includes about 8% that are certified biodynamic, but many, many use biodynamic methods within the organic category, but they pick and choose them and they don't want to be certified. The volumes vary hugely because of the up and down vintages, which I'm going to come on to into a minute. Now, I also, people, I don't know, but when you talk about other regions of France, I'm not sure whether people always give you the figures of how many producers there are. And most French and indeed Italian regions have got lots and lots of small producers. And 210 producers within the AOC, which includes 4 cooperatives, but the biggest 10 produce 50% of the volume. Now, if we went to the biggest 3, let's say, I can't remember, but it's something like a third of the volume. And this isn't actually that different from, say, Australia, which is completely different in terms of size, obviously massive, but you still have this handful of producers that dominate volume. And this means that, back to Jura, you've got 200 producers that are producing the other 50%. And so obviously some of them are very, very, very tiny indeed. Now, exports have absolutely shot up. They were 2% when I first started visiting and writing about the Jura, which was in 2002. So 23 years ago, they were 2%. By the time I published Jura Wine, exports were about 10%. Now they're hugely variable because of the quantities being so varied, but somewhere between 20 and 30% depending on the year. Now, I hesitated whether to do this next slide, but I've done it for you. I've not done it in consecutive order. And this is a bit more than what is in the new book and a bit less than what is in the new book. This is a huge generalization, but it was quite interesting to put it together. I decided to go back to 2011. So we've got 14 vintages up to the most recent one. Why did I go back to 2011? Because it's always cited in the Jura as until recently, they said, well, 2011 was when we had good volumes and we had really nice quality as well. There are only 3 vintages, 11, 18, and 23, where there were seriously good volumes and, of course, good quality. 15, 20, and 22 were okay, but they were below what used to be an average. Today, we can't really do averages. They were all very hot vintages, very dry. There were semi-drought conditions. Jura doesn't suffer from drought as much as some regions because of the marl soils, which help with the drainage and so on. But it does have an effect. Mostly these were the top quality wines. On the other hand, the heat did cause problems in 20 and 22, as it did in 2018, in the cellars of particularly natural wine producers who could not, and in some cases still can't get certain vats and barrels to finish fermentations. I know full well that there are some natural wine producers out there with 18s that have not yet finished fermentation. Somewhat worrying, and certainly there are 20s and 22s. These are obviously in a tiny minority. There were some really tricky vintages, 2 of them leading up to my book, my first book, which sort of filled me with a bit of fear. They were really miserable summers, 12 and 13 all over France, I believe, very, very rainy. 14 came along and it was really looking quite good. But then they had the dreaded Drosophila Suzuki, which, to be fair, more or less only hitted Pulsar, but Pulsar is very important for the Jura. It did hit Pinot Noir a little bit, but mainly it was Pulsar. And it was shocking, and it filled them with terror. I've written more about that in the book, so you can read about Drosophila Suzuki, which also hit Gamay and Beaujolais and a few other places that year. It's came back a little bit in 23, I think, and possibly 24, but it hasn't caused huge damage. 2016 ended up mainly being a good vintage, but boy, it was really difficult and the quantities were down. And I've left the worst till last. I mean, yes, I mean, this sort of almost makes me weep and was very, very emotional. I found it really emotional. This is the inside story doing this research. I knew about 17, 19 and 21, and then of the frost of 24 hit when I was on my a very, very last visit. I was actually driving back to the UK and I had 2 nights there, and I was there for the frost of 24, and it was horrific. I had been there 2 weeks before in the second week of April, and I was shocked at how advanced the vines were. They were at exactly the same level that they had been in 2013 when Mick Rock came out to Jura to do photography for my first book. Now, 2013, as you saw, was a wet vintage, very difficult. It was very, very late. We'd booked the 2 weeks that he was coming out for the end of May, early June. We thought that would be perfect for spring, early summer pictures, and there were only 6 leaves on the vines. However, there were 6 leaves on the vines at the beginning of April in 24. And so the frost was just waiting to happen. And personally, I sort of became like a vigneron. I went into denial, like it can't possibly happen. And that's how the vignerons think. You know, you watch it in the weather forecast and it came closer and closer. This cold snap was going to come and you just can't believe it's going to happen. And it happened. And it was just horrific. So I got overexcited and pushed my mouse too far. Those losses are averages. They vary hugely. It's in 17, they made obviously a big song and dance about it. However, they had not had a bad frost since 91. They'd had frosts, but they weren't, they were 10% loss, 5%, 10% loss. So they didn't really count as being catastrophic. They were all really shocked in 17, but then they shrugged and they went, well, hey, we haven't had a frost like this since 91. So I guess it's time for one. So when the next frost happened in 19, they were extremely shocked and they all rushed out to try and find ways of avoiding it for the future, and so it went on. 21 was completely catastrophic. Every producer that I knew, the retired producers or the people that had just retired, they all said, we have never, ever, ever seen anything as bad as 21. Nobody ever believed it could be worse. And then 24 was worse than 21. So this is far worse than what happened in Burgundy. Forgive me, anybody who follows Burgundy, they didn't have an easy time. Nobody had an easy time in 24. And in 21, most people didn't have an easy time. But it's far worse. It's far worse than what happened in Germany. Of course, there's isolated cases that are worse in every area. And in Jura, there were a few places that were spared the worst of the frost in 24. L'Etoile did a bit better, and Arles did a bit better, but they were the only areas, and they got hit by mildew, of course, as everybody did. So there you have it. So here's the paradox. There's this growing worldwide demand. This is more or less the same as saying Jura has become a star. But one thing I didn't really talk about, this demand is now all over the world, all over the world. And the big difference is Paris. Now, when I first visited the Jura in 20 plus years ago, and I would visit a producer for the first time, I would ask them if they exported, and they sort of looked at me, and this little smile would come up, and they would go, "Well, only to Paris." And it was, and and honestly, they sold very little to Paris, and they sold a little bit to Lyon, but nearly all the wine was sold in the local Franche-Comté region. And by the time my first book came along in 2014, there was far more wine from Jura available in New York than there was in Paris. Paris, a bit like London, still hadn't really grasped it. And then suddenly it all happened. And this is creating a really complicated market because all the somms in Paris desperately want to get Jura wine. And certainly all the small producers, all the organic producers who are thinking about carbon footprint and selling local and all the rest are going, well, maybe we should drop our export markets. Whereas before they were thanking their export markets. So we're in a pretty delicate situation at the moment. And again, I've written a bit more about that in the book, but it's something that is a little worrying. On the other hand, for big producers, they still have capacity. And that when I say big, I mean more like the cooperatives and negotiations and so on. They are riding on the coattails of the rock stars, and they're very grateful for it. And they say so. They're not jealous. They're really, really grateful to the rock star producers. And so most of the rest I talked about already. Limited allocation cuvées is a big thing because I talked right at the beginning about the diversity, and some producers who only have 6 hectares, let's say, make 25 cuvées in a good year, in a good volume year. And so consumers, Jura geeks, whether they're professionals or consumers, taste a particular cuvée and want to buy it, and they can't buy it. And so there's this sort of knock-on of this growing demand and growing desperation for some of the wines. So declining quantity, what on earth can they do about it? We've seen the vintages. We've seen that climate change has brought huge challenges to the Jura. The reason for the spring frosts is very simple. It is simply that the late winter months, February and March, have got much, much warmer. So therefore, the budding has become earlier, the growth has become earlier, and therefore, when the cold spell in April comes, as it has always come, and that hasn't changed except for some years, obviously, but in some years that happens. In 4 years, in the last 8 years, it's happened, and the vines are so far developed. That's why. It brings other challenges as well. The search for solutions are just like in other regions. All sorts of frost protection methods have been tried. I've written about that in the book. You can read it there. They're trying, obviously, later pruning as late as possible, but that's a logistical nightmare. They're also trying secondary pruning, where you do a first rough prune, but you leave one cane long, and then the frost, if it comes, will only hit the end of that cane. So they're trying all these things, but there are issues of cost, of labor that they cannot afford, and some of the frost protection methods are environmentally damaging. Not just lighting fires, but using energy for various things and so on. So it's very, very difficult. They're trying different using ground cover, not using ground cover, doing higher training, etc., etc. But these are things that are being tried in other regions too. The winery, climate change has come into the winery, mainly for natural wine producers, but not only for natural wine producers. In these very warm summers that we've been having, this is definitely no longer a cool climate wine region. It hasn't been a cool climate wine region for at least a decade now. And therefore, the acidities have plummeted. And so if you're using less addition of sulfite and lower additions of sulfite, and if you're using natural yeast, it's obvious that you're going to have potential problems with finishing fermentation, but you're also opening the door for bacteria to come and faults to come. So this is a big, big issue that is happening. The solutions are there, but the solutions are not necessarily what producers want and what their customers want, because many of the customers are looking for natural wines from the Jura and are quite strict in their criteria. I'm going to talk in a minute about the difficulties of extending the area, which would be one sort of solution in that you would get more volume. This has led to speculation of land and of wines, which we can talk about a bit in a minute. The declining quantity has meant that some producers have decided to get as big as possible to combat that. And you can sort of see that if they are producers that go back generations, they've built up stocks, they have got new generations, so therefore they can actually afford to get more vineyards and so on. And so this gives them a sort of backstop by becoming bigger. But many, especially of the newer ones, decide to go smaller instead, meaning they don't need any staff, meaning they can reduce their costs, and meaning that they can have second strings to their bow. Some of them have started microbreweries, some of them have beehives, some of them not just, more like the mid-size ones, are doing tourism ventures to get more money. Let's have a gîte, let's do chambre d'hôte, let's do this. Just anything in case that suddenly they have a year where there's no income from the wine. So all of these changes have been happening. I thought you might be interested to know why expansion is so difficult. There's just over 2,000 hectares planted. There's 8,000 hectares of unplanted AOC land. So in 2017, the Comité Interprofessionnel des Vins du Jura, the CIVJ, commissioned a study. And the study was done by volunteers. This is how things work. There's no money in the Jura, despite the fact that the wines go up and up in price. There's no money for the regional bodies because there's no volume, and the regional bodies are funded by volume. And so the volunteers went out and looked at all this land and assessed it to see whether it really could be planted. So in other words, was it actually built on already? If it's built on already, obviously you can't plant. And if it's very enshrined in Comté, as cow pasture, actually Comté cheese is a bit easier and more lucrative and so on. And then some of the land would have taken so much money to clear forest or whatever. If it was on steep land and so on, it wouldn't be suitable. But they did identify 2,000 hectares that could be planted on, which is quite a lot. However, only 200 has been planted since 2015. I find it quite hard to understand why, but France is hard to understand sometimes. There are all sorts of bureaucratic challenges, the way you get hold of the permissions that you need, the paperwork you have to do. There's all sorts of competition for land, competition for vineyards. When you're a young vigneron and you want to set up you are supposed to get priority for vineyard land and for new land, but that doesn't always happen, especially if word gets around that you want to make natural wines and that you might not be in the AOC and that you might leave the AOC and do Vin de France. You go to the bottom of the list. There's a lot of politics with a small p. There's also shock, horror, foreigners, especially foreigners from Burgundy, a whole hour away, who are coming in, and they talk about with horror the Burgundians that are coming in to invade us. I mean, I think that most of us on this Zoom would probably think that it would be great having Burgundians coming into Jura and bringing in their expertise and their fame and their sales networks and so on. But the Jurassiens don't think of it in that way. They worry about it. They have a certain fear about it. But it has happened up to a certain extent, and I'll mention that briefly before the end. So that's what's happening there. A little bit on wine styles and grapes and some nitty-gritty as to what's changing and what's doing well. Now, really, honestly, they should get rid of Pulsar. Don't tell them I said that. Everybody loves Pulsar or Plusar, but it gets every disease under the sun. It's frost prone. It's the one that got Drosophila. It gets normal Drosophila, never mind the Suzuki version. It has such thin skins. And then it's very difficult once it gets into the winery. On the other hand, it's sort of like the little girl that when she was bad, she was very, very bad, but when she was good, she was wonderful. And yeah, they love Pulsar because they have an audience for it, both locally. They have the consumers, but locally and internationally, Pulsar is adored. And it doesn't grow anywhere else apart from down the road in Bouget a little bit. Pinot Noir has remained fairly stable. It's actually done better than I thought. I got it wrong in my first book. I thought it would suffer from climate change, but it's really hanging on in there and is quite useful. Sorry, I have to have a little bit of water. So it's pretty useful. It's used more and more in the Cremant blends. It's also used for Macvin, Rosé and Red, and it's doing well. Trousseau is by far the most resilient in terms of climate change, and I still don't understand quite why they haven't planted more. Everybody I speak to says that that's what they plant if they want to plant more, but the statistics don't add up. So this is a bit of a mystery to me. I'm hoping it will go up in the next few years. Blends which were, I can't put a date on this, but I suspect that 80 years ago or something, well, let's say in the 50s and 60s, 1950s and 1960s, almost all reds would have been blends. And traditionally they would have all been blends. So I think that they're growing in importance slowly. There's a lot of traditional producers that don't want to do them because they have always done single varietals and varietal wine reds, and that's what their customers want. But I really feel they need to and they should do this, and I think they're delicious when I try them. But there we go. They're increasingly made for, well, I say made for early drinking. By early drinking in Jura, I mean within 10 years usually. Jura wines age so very, very well. But what I mean by that is that they are not increasingly not aged in oak. So traditionally they were never aged in, well, hundreds of years ago they would have only been aged in oak. Then at the beginning of modern times they were always aged in tank. I mean, one of the big learning experiences for me when I first went 20 plus years ago was that everything was upside down, and I learned that the red wines were aged in tank, the white wines in barrel, the red wines were released young, the white wines were released older. and it's just like completely opposite to every other region. Um, since COVID in particular, barrels have been in short supply, especially second-hand barrels, and that's what they tend to buy. And so there's another practical reason for making reds in tanks. Now, there are lots of exceptions. Plenty of people are using big, small, medium barrels for red wine making, but I'm seeing more in tank. Chardonnay, I don't know what to say. It's so frost prone. And in the southern part of the region in particular, where there's more limestone and where there's more tradition for growing Chardonnay, they are so reliant on it, and yet it is the most frost prone of all. And that's very, very worrying. And everybody adores the terroir selections that can be done in a good year. And it's needed for Cremant, it's needed for Macvin. So I don't know what the answer is here, but it's a very important variety still. Melon à Queue Rouge, which I did write about in the first book as a natural variation of Chardonnay, traditional to the Jura. It's genetically the same. Nowadays, they've sort of figured out the marketing and you can see it on labels. It's quite fun. And they've sort of isolated it. And they also take more and more mass selections or sélection massale of Melon à Queue Rouge to replant. Savagnin is the great variety of the Jura. Even Savagnin suffered in 2024. What happened in 2024 is that those vineyards that were not frosted of Savagnin, because they were on the higher slopes, many of them had I'm going to get this wrong now, a pre-flowering, no, even pre-setting abortion of berries. It was so cold for several weeks after the frost that the future berries, future flowers just dropped off. And Savagnin is prone to that, but it's very rare that it happens. It happened in 2013, and the next time was 2024. Other than that, it's a very hardy variety. It has thicker skins. Normally it has good acidity. On the other hand, they're beginning to pick it earlier than Chardonnay for sous-voile wines, because for sous-voile wines, oxidative wines, you really need the acid levels to be able to keep that wine stable under the veil of yeast with that oxidative effect. And so they're picking it earlier and earlier, which is intriguing. And just like there's Melon à Queue Rouge for Chardonnay, with Savagnin, there is Savagnin Rose, there's Savagnin Vert and Savagnin Jaune. They're not always talked about on labels, and it's quite a complicated situation, but it is very much prized still. There are no figures as to how much of it is made into Savagnin Rouillé, but I will topped up Savagnin. But what I will tell you is that in my first book, I would say there were still traditional producers who would have said to me then, never, ever will we make a Savagnin Rouillé. This is not the tradition. Our clients don't want it. I don't know anybody who says that anymore. Everybody, and I think the big change is that the locals have started to appreciate topped up Savagnin. Whereas in the past, the locals said, no, 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 our local wine is sous-voile, it's oxidative, and that's what we like. But all of that is changing, but there are no figures for it. And but sous-voile and vin jaune and all the rest will not disappear. I promise you it won't disappear. And even the new producers who've never made one desperately want to make one. But it's very expensive to put aside a barrel for 7 years, you know? It's very, very expensive. And if you're new to actually, and there's a great risk attached as well. And so it's a complicated situation, like everything in the Jura. Just briefly, the other styles, Cremant is hanging on in there. I didn't actually mention Pet Nat, but I meant to mention Pet Nat as well. Pet Nat is, of course, Pétillant Naturel is only under Vin de France. In my first book 10 years ago, it was very much on the rise. Everybody was loving it. It's still adored and it's still delicious when in fact, more delicious than it used to be, but they can only make it in an abundant year. And you've seen how few abundant years there are. And that's a problem for Cremant as well. It's very, very important for exports for the bigger companies, Cremant. It's vital. And yet, if you've got Chardonnay, which is the main grape for Cremant, being frosted, it's a huge issue. So the percentage of production has come down, but it still remains at a quarter. Lack of acidity is a concern. Sauvignon, the rules at the moment do not allow more than 30% of Sauvignon in the blend, which is ridiculous. And there is a move to change the rules, but it hasn't happened yet. So we will see. I'm not sure whether some of you know Domaine du Pélican, which is the outpost of Marquis d'Angeville in Jura. They make the one wine they make that is not under appellation contrôlée is their sparkling wine, which is 100% Sauvignon. And it is François Duvivier who's more in charge of the Jura outpost, who is battling to get 100% Sauvignon allowed within the AOC. I don't think it's ever going to happen, but I do think that they should increase the 30% up to at least 50%, because it gives the acidity to the sparkling wine base. It's obvious. Increasing amounts of low, zero, and zero dosage wine. Thank goodness for that. Cremant de Jura for a long time has been really too sweet with dosage. Vin de Paille, I would say, is the one of the myriad wine styles of Jura that is really under threat. There is less and less made. It's almost impossible to make it within the rules. The rules require for a minimum of 6 weeks of drying. They have to apply for a derogation to dry it for less. That's done on a regional basis, that they apply for a derogation. And the problem is that if you are picking in the middle of August, which is what is increasingly happening, and you pick the grapes for Vin de Paille right at the beginning because they are healthy and ripe and clean, but then it's so warm when you're drying it that within 3 weeks they're desiccated. And you need to press at 3 weeks. So, and honestly, the sales aren't that great. It was always done as a sort of little giveaway if somebody bought a big amount or that sort of thing. Macvin is thriving in many, many markets, not only the home market. And I recently did a little book tour in the Netherlands, and they adore Macvin over there. So as much as possible is imported into the Netherlands. It's a strange style to me, but people like it. It's easy to make. It's good cash flow. And it's perfect for the great purity of fruit of organic grapes in particular, because effectively it's made from juice and Mar du Jura. Very quickly, I just thought I'd run through the many, many factions and categories of this tiny region of the sorts of wines that they have. The cooperatives are hanging on in there. They're doing okay. They've reduced a bit, not surprisingly, as they have all over Europe, but not dramatically. There's still 450 hectares that is incorporated, is sort of handled by cooperatives that are known as fruitières. Negociants, there's lots and lots of negociants that are very small. There's lots of producers that are getting negociant status as well to give them more flexibility. I haven't got time to go into the natural wine producers who are a certain number of them are when they have literally no Jura wine are buying grapes from Alsace, from Languedoc, from all over the place in order to have a second line to keep themselves going. That's one of the ways they're doing that. Maison de Vigneron, Jean de France, they are responsible for the Cremant that those of you in the UK will have seen over many years in Aldi at a ridiculously cheap price, a loss leader there, and it exists in other markets as well under all sorts of different names. They now own 55 hectares. Everybody was very worried that they were going to take over everything. They have grown from 30 something in the last 10 years ago, but I think that that's fine that they own 55. Even if they were to go up to 75, I wouldn't be worried by their dominance. They've got a very good person in charge and they're doing a very good job environmentally. I know she would like to go organic, but her bosses don't let her. They buy in 140 hectares, which is much less than before. Henri
Wink,
Maire.
excuse me, Wink, can I just interrupt to say you have about 9 minutes remaining? We have 2 questions, so I just wanted to give you the time.
This is I think the last slide actually. Henri Maire's owned by Boisset. They're doing a great job in the vineyards. Wine quality is a bit of a wait and see. So the individual producers, there are two very important groupings. One in particular, well, one very important grouping, which is L'Année d'Olivet, which runs wine fairs in Jura and in Paris, and they are very much a support group to each other. They've grown hugely. And then Juracine is a new grouping that was created by some of the sort of old faithful producers, but who've become organic, and they were not allowed in by L'Année d'Olivet. They were rejected, so they've created their own group, and they're quite interesting, and they'll be at Wine Paris. They were at Wine Paris in 24 as well. And then there's all the rest, and there's also what people talk about a lot, which are the various producers who've deserted the AOC entirely and only make Vin de France. There's a few notable names there. And a lot of people panic about it and say they encourage a lot of the new natural wine producers to join them. In terms of sheer quantity, I would say that they are less than 5% of the vineyard area. So it's not too much of a disaster yet. The Burgundians, though, are terrible. 20% of the land, but that includes Domaine Mare. It really isn't that bad. So no wine to sell. Speculation has reared its head. That is a whole nother story. It has just followed on from Burgundy. It is quite horrific that a small, tiny region should have speculation. Just an example, the people at the bottom, Domaine des Miroirs, that's a picture from 13 years ago. They sell their wine only to trade and exporters, averaging about 30 euros a bottle. Currently, it is on the market in various places at over $1,000, euros, or pounds. These two cannot afford to have any employees. I'll just leave that there. Oops. So photography, do not steal it. Almost all of it was taken by Mick Rock. The map was Quentin Sadler's, so don't share it without permission. Thank you very much. My books are available from Académie du Vin Library, who give a discount to Circle of Wine Writers members, others that are not a member on this call. You'll have to pay full price unless they do a special offer, which they often do. Thank you. Happy to take questions.
Wink, thank you so much for that race through an update of just so much that's been going on. And I'm sure you really only scratched the surface, but your expertise is incredibly valuable to us who want that insider knowledge. We had a couple of questions. Patricia Stefanowitz, MW, I know you've partly covered exports, but she was asking, if the wines are generally on allocation to non-domestic markets. Patricia, if you're still on, would you like to unmute and chat with Wink briefly?
I was just curious as to how they would do that with such variable volumes, Wink, and whether
Patricia, I can
how
not
that
hear
would
you,
fit.
but I did hear Meg's question.
Patricia, do you want to just speak up a little tiny bit into your mic?
I'll try. What I was really trying to discover is how they would allocate wines with such variable quantities per year.
With great difficulty. It's as simple as that. You know, they just and honestly, I think some of the speculation has come about by traditional French buyers that have been given allocations, selling off part of their allocations. So French restaurants that have traditionally been a customer for a particular highly sought after producer, if they get given 6 bottles of a particular cuvee, I've heard that some of them keep 2 or 3 for their list and sell the rest, and that increases speculation because that goes onto the grey market eventually. I've even heard of Australia receiving wines that were originally destined for a French restaurant. So it's a nightmare. I think even if you spoke to Stéphane Tissot, who has 50 hectares, but in a normal year would have at least 30 cuvées, and in a big year would have more. If you spoke to him and his wife about how they do allocations, it's really tough. Simple as that.
Yeah, and I guess, I mean, obviously people don't make quite enough anyway, so it becomes.
I'm sorry, I just
they
can't
would
hear
be
you.
able to sell it if they stopped allocating to somebody who was a customer. Thanks.
Well, I hope I've answered you anyway, because I couldn't completely hear whether that was a follow-on question or not.
No, that's all right.
Okay, great. Thank you very much, Patricia. Also, Trevor, Sharat, if you're still here, you talked about Jura style wines made outside of the AOP. Do you want to come on and ask your question of Wink? If you're still here.
Trevor is here, but he's on mute.
Can
Here
you
we go.
hear me now?
Yes, we can.
Great. Okay, I did click the unmute, but it didn't unclick. When I wrote this question in the chat before you pointed out that most of the appellation areas are not actually planted, so it may be the silly question now, but I'm increasingly interested in the IGPs that we never seem to talk about. And you look up Jura on the web, and it's all about the appellations. Are any of the Jura styles of wines made in what would presumably be the IGP Franche-Comté, as opposed to the appellations?
Okay, so IGP Franche-Comté is not allowed. Jura producers in the AOC are not allowed to do IGP Franche-Comté. Any area designated as AOC land, the IGP term may not be used in the Jura, hence why they use Vin de France. So the Vin de France producers, so IGP Franche-Comté is literally in different departments. It's in the Doubs, it's in the Haute-Saône, it's the vineyards in the neighboring departments.
Okay, my question is about those geographical areas. Do they make wines of the styles we would recognize as Jura styles in those areas?
Some of them do, some of them don't. Some Jura producers, some of the small Jura producers, especially in the north of Arbois, near Salins-les-Bains and near the Doubs border, they have vineyards in both. They have some vineyards within the Jura AOC, and they have some vineyards within the Doubs. So some of them will be making red blends that might be Jura style, but generally it's so tiny, Trevor, that I mean, if you take Jura generally being tiny, the IGP Franche-Comté is even tinier, but I did not update that part of my book. If you look in the first book, you'll be able to read something about them in the first book, but it's not a part that I updated.
Yeah. I'll go back to it. Thanks a lot.
Yeah.
Thank you very much for that question. I believe that's all the questions. And Wink, thank you very much. This was really, really fascinating. Great update. And you had many, many thanks in the chat as well for such a great presentation.